All right.
I want to start with a general question. We're familiar with your repeat collaborations with Todd Haynes, Ulrich Seidel. This was your first time working with Pablo Larrain. So I'm wondering, when you're considering collaborating with a new for you filmmaker, what are some of the things that you look for in that collaboration? What makes you feel interested?
Well, generally, like any, technician, the director picks you. You don't pick them. But I was following Pablo's, work from Tony Manero on, and we met. I don't remember if we met at Telluride or the New York Film Festival, but we met at one of those festivals, and I, expounded how much I appreciated and thought he was a brilliant filmmaker. And so we just kind of kept up a friendship at different festivals we would run into each other. And then he said to me one day, "Hey, I'm going to bring you to Chile." Well, funny enough, he came to New York and shot a film in New York, and he used a wonderful cinematographer, Darius Conde, and I thought, wow, he came all the way to New York and he didn't call me. Well, I'm never going to call me for Chile, But I did I think it was checking me out, I did a commercial with him in LA, and that, I guess, went well, and then he invited me to come to Chile to shoot this film, and I jumped at the chance.
And how familiar were you with Chilean history and the Pinochet regime and some of the things that are have been really prominent in Pablo's cinema even prior to this, but maybe never this blatant?
Well, actually, through his films, I became more and more familiar with that period, because that 17 years, he explored through the common man, and this was one direct on, but I kind of learned about it through that and trying to find out about what that whole period was about.
So let's start talking more specifically about El Conde. You've shot this in black and white. I'm wondering if that was the intention from day one, and what were some of the reasons behind that intention?
Yeah, he it was Netflix from Mexico, and he went directly to them and said, I want to shoot this film in black and white, and he said visually that he had always saw Pinochet with his long cape like a vampire. and obviously everybody understands the metaphor, I mean, he sucked the blood out of their whole, their economy, their history, he was this evil. And so it made sense. So once I knew we were really going to shoot in black and white and not shoot in color, and then, that's generally the way it's done, because most producers want to shoot, when you shoot in color, when you shoot in black and white, they want it, one form of it in color if they can't sell it in certain markets, that they have that as a possibility. Plus, in film, it becomes more and more difficult. I just shot a second film with Pablo in Budapest, and part of that film was in black and white, film negative. But because there wasn't any more labs in Chile, and we would have to, it would have been a bigger expense, obviously, to shoot in film, though we wanted to. So then I looked around at what sensors in the digital world would be monochromatic, and Red had a sensor that could have been shot, and actually Arri had a smaller model, an XT, not to get too technical, but had a model, but not this large format, not the format that Pablo wanted to shoot in. And Pablo had a relationship with Arri from his other films, so he wanted to shoot with Arri. And that was what was available, Arri cameras in that area. But they didn't have any monochromatic camera for this format. So I reached out to a friend in Germany who's an optical engineer and a cinematographer, and he's very close with area. I said, would there be any chance that they could come up with a monochromatic sensor? And they were coming out with a new camera at that time, the Alexa 35, a color camera. And I never thought they would ever come up with this, but I certainly asked. And they said, we'll consider it, we've been thinking about it. And they came up with it in 2 months, and they said, but you have to do the test because we don't know what the speed of the camera is, the ASA. So I got the camera 10 days before we're to shoot, and to my pleasant surprise, it was faster. In other words, I could shoot lower light with it than I could with a color camera. And then that opened up all the possibilities of why I wanted to shoot with a monochromatic camera. I could use black and white filters the way they did, 30, 40 years ago to change the contrast in the skies and the colors that you're looking at. The wardrobe could be designed towards the black and white. The sets could be. And then I was also everything kind of fell into place in this film. I had rehoused a set of lenses that were from the black and white period, 70 years ago. They were called Baltar lenses. They were Bosch and Lowen. They were like the first lenses that were used in these early black and white films. And not to say there weren't other manufacturers, but they were the first like American manufacturer that made black and white glass. And it was a simpler design than the lenses we use today. The coatings were different. So those were adapted for the large format camera. So I had that. Then the fourth thing that I had was I have been working for the last 10 years on an exposure mapping system where I can interpret the exposure from what I'm seeing. And I've been up against the wall with camera manufacturers because they don't want to change the way they've been doing it. Even though they say, yeah, that's a great idea, but and it's based on, if you know anything about photography on Ansel Adams' 18% gray, his own system. So I adapted that to the digital world. But a monitor company, Small HD, you really wanted all this in.
I think everybody here wants to hear this technical detail.
A monitor company that we use on our digital cameras to look at the image, adapted it. They understood it, and they made a monitor that could receive the signal from the camera and interpret the exposure from what you're looking at. So they got that to me just in time. And this was the first film that would use that technology. And that's why there's such subtlety in the mid-range, the grays, because I could control where the highlights were and the shadow detail, and I could see it visually what I had. When you shoot in film, you do it with your light meter, your eye, your knowledge, but you don't actually see it. Here, I could actually see it. Now, it's true, you can say, well, you can see the image as a digital image, but there's a difference when you can come back a month, a year, 6 months, and look at a readout in this 18% gray format and see exactly what you did. So I could be very consistent of recreating what I was doing in different locations or in the same set. So that, I hope that.
So you basically invented your own exposure control system. I think it's called EL zone system, Ed Lachman zone system.
No, it's the exposure latitude.
But that's how they will.
Just a coincidence. But one other funny story, I'm in this wheelchair, I broke my hip, so they always say in theater, if you break your leg, you have good luck. So I broke my hip, maybe that gave me good luck, I don't know.
So maybe tell us a little bit about, when you're shooting in black and white, you mentioned that contrasts and shadows are a lot more important than obviously how the colors are going to work with each other. What were some of the things that you had to consider? For instance, I'm thinking blood. How did you figure out what shade of color or what color the blood should be in order to?
That was Pablo, which I never thought about. He said, let's test different colors for blood, because generally red would come out very deep black. Red is a color, then black and white is the darkest color, except black, but it has a richness to it. And we did tests, and we ended up with blue, which is really interesting because the blue has a certain, we felt, luminosity that the red didn't. And so we ended up using blue. Then when I was, this is another funny story, when I was in the hospital with the hospital's special surgery, which still didn't get repaired right, they told me, if you look in your hand, you have blue veins. Somebody told me, and I don't know if somebody else told me this isn't true, but the blood inside of us is actually blue, and it becomes red when it's oxidized to air. So that was like a weird coincidence.
It was meant to be blue then. I recall when we had a conversation, you and I, here a few months ago, I remember you mentioning that you approach lighting, especially the lighting of the eyes in this movie, a little bit differently. You allow some shadow. So I'm wondering if you could open that up for us. Why did you approach it differently?
Yeah. One of the other things that Pablo wanted to do is, and he built the set for this, was to use a 15-foot technocrane. It's a crane that retracts and telescopes in and out. You don't have to move the camera to move backwards or forwards. It's done within the arm. So the set was actually built for that. So we had enough room to move around, and it was very liberating because you could find angles you wouldn't maybe find. You didn't have to bring the dolly to a place and move the track. So you could, even though this crane has track you could use if you have to go further. So what was I left with? I was left with, when you shoot this way, that I have to light, you don't want to see a light in the room. So I was left to light through the windows, right? And then overhead I have ambient light through a muslin or a silk, just to give a base level. But I told them from the beginning, I'm gonna need 15 feet, or in their terminology, 4 meters or whatever, to the fire lane. That's where you're allowed to have open area to your set. To the wall of your set. But when I got there, I had about 8 feet. So I go, what am I gonna do? Well, I kind of was forced into doing something that we do in commercials, where you paper the window, and I like 1,000 H's tracing paper, so I papered the window. And part of the problem it was that, and this is a problem for all cinematographers, when you shoot on location first and then you're going to shoot the exteriors, you don't know what the light's going to be in the exteriors. So you kind of get caught if you make a choice, like everybody wants beautiful sunlight coming in the windows, and then you get there and it's overcast, right? So I was very emphatic to understand what the weather was in Patagonia, in this southernmost part of Chile, that it was winter, and that they told me that the weather could change rapidly from clouds to sunlight to overcast. So I made a decision that by papering the window, I had this light coming through, hitting the window, but every day I would decide, and I would rip little pieces of the paper away so I would get some hard light in. And that's kind of how I lit the scene. But a lot of time, they always say the eyes are the soul of the camera, or the soul of the whatever. So Gordon Willis was famous because, he did The Godfather. He would top light everything and the eyes would go dark. So that's kind of been a trend for certain Harris Reed's used to love to do that. So here I was with light coming in the window, but I was losing the eyes. And I was at first kind of like, oh, what am I gonna do? You know, because I couldn't have they call it an eye light. I could have had a light on the camera, but then I would always have to be moving the light up and down. I don't know, I don't personally like that because I feel it looks too much like a movie, you know, and I like lighting that feels very naturalistic. But I realized something, and I discussed it with Pablo, because one day he came and said, you know, we've got to help the eyes out. And I said, you know, these people are hiding from themselves, and they're hiding from each other. And maybe that's a good way to show the feeling of what they're doing, is that if we do lose the eyes. And he went with it. And that's so, a lot of times the eyes are lost, but I kind of went with it. And then Pablo did something else very interesting that I had never done before. All those interventions or those discussions between Carmen and the children, he would put two cameras next to each other. And we actually tried to do it in this last film, but we couldn't because we were shooting film cameras and they were too wide. But by putting digital cameras next to each other, they're smaller, they're narrower. And then I just lit it with a China ball, so they were lit from one source either way. And why a director likes that is then he has coverage of exactly that scene. It's not like you do one person's close up, then you cut, and then you do the other person's close up. But to actually have the same performance and the same dialogue in that moment is very liberating for the performance. So all those things contributed to what the look was. And I say it this way, like, I like to light the space and let the actors move through the space to create the image, rather than light them in the space per se. And, you know, this kind of film, you know, that's kind of references Gothic, you know, horror films or films from the silent period, like you know, Nosferatu, or later Vampire by Carl Dreyer. They used lighting that was very theatrical, but I don't know. I just went with this style. It was kind of, in a way, I always am influenced by what I have to work with, you know, and so I was kind of forced into doing what ended up being, you know, it's you know, it always changes, you know, the people you work with, and you know, I would say, hey, do we have a 10K? And they'd go, they didn't want to say no to me, but they just didn't. It was always manana. So I realized I wasn't going to get it, and I just went with what I had.
Just in a minute, I want to take some questions from the audience as well. But before we throw it over there, I want to ask about the flight scenes, the flight sequences. I'm wondering what you can tell us about those, both nighttime and daytime.
Yeah, that's another form of brilliance of Pablo. Obviously, the night scenes where Pinochet is flying over the city, that was shot against blue screen, what they say. You know, green screen or blue screen, you can cut them out and you can put them in. But the day scenes with Carmencita flying, he had seen, I think, a commercial. In fact, I've been trying to call him to ask him, but I think he saw a commercial from Colombia, and it was these aerial photographers and circus performers that were working on wires. And we actually, she studied ballet when she was younger, Carmen. So she wanted to do this. We had a stunt double, and there's a few shots with a stunt double, but over 80% of that is really her doing it. And it was like a 90-foot crane. She's on wires. She can rotate, and then there's a grip in a seat below on wires also, holding something called a remote head, which is it's called a Ronin. And then from the remote head, and he's holding actually it's like a platform that the camera can move on, is the operator down below on the ground moving the camera through wheels. So it had this incredible believability and feeling of, well, what she's going through and her sense of freedom by doing it that way, I think.
Yeah, incredible.